Hear me? Hello, good morning.
John, we can hear you. Just go ahead.
Okay. Good morning and welcome to yet another webinar, IEA's webinar. This is the 32nd webinar this year. Just to mention, of course, the Institute of Economic Affairs is a think tank, and what we do is basically promote debate and dialogue on public policy issues. So today we would like to welcome you to this webinar, which is titled Refuting the Fallacy, Poor Economic Performance Causes a Rise in Crime Rates in Kenya. Now, as a way of background, we know that many a times we hear statements, whether from politicians or stuff that we read in the media, of various pronouncements and so on. And sometimes on the face value of this is they are made as if it's a matter of fact. And that's why that increasingly we know, we are aware of fake news, and what is happening is that increasingly we have fact checks, actually media houses or institutions that are doing fact checking whether some of these statements or pronouncements are factual. Now today will be, I think this is the third or fourth webinar on this fallacy. And what we'll be doing is that the IEA, in the build-up to the launch of 50 fallacies, that economic fallacies that we've put together, we'll be taking you through some of these fallacies as a teaser, and just to basically whet your appetite in the run-up to that launch. And so in today's webinar, we will have Anna Grace and Maureen Baraza will be taking us through this. They'll be breaking this webinar down. And the first part of this, in terms of the background and the theory behind this fallacy, we will start with Maureen, and then Anna Grace will pick up from there. They will obviously explain what a fallacy is, and then of course take us through the arguments around this fallacy. So without further ado, I would like to welcome them to take us through this. The entire webinar will take about an hour and a half. So if you have any notes, any questions or comments, please note them down either in the chat box, because we'll have a session after they are done with the presentation for question and answer. So Anna Grace, Maureen, please welcome.
Thank you, John. Good morning. My name is Anna Grace, and I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs in the special programs. And I'll begin with the presentation. I hope you can all see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So as John has mentioned, this is again a webinar which is in a series of webinars whereby we are refuting common fallacies made by people in their everyday lives. And today's fallacy is that poor economic performance causes a rise in crime rates, and we'll be taking you through it. My name is Anna Grace, joined by my colleague Maureen. So the outline of our presentation is, first we'll begin with a background of what the economic fallacies are and how many we have so far, what we intend to do with this project, and then we'll go straight ahead to the fallacy of the day, whereby we'll state the claim and then we'll refute the assumptions that people make as they commit such fallacies, and then finally go into our conclusions. So to kick it off, we begin with the background of the 53 economic fallacies. So as mentioned earlier, these are just common statements that people make about the economy, and they believe them to be true, with such strong conviction. And as the Institute of Economic Affairs, as our mandate, dictates we are to elevate the level of public discourse. And this is anywhere from what's said on the media to what just people speak about in their private conversations. And that's why we decided to come up with this book, which we are titling The 53 Economic Fallacies, whereby we are refuting these common misconceptions people make based on facts, empirical data, and economic theory. So based on those three pillars, we'll dissect these statements and see whether they're consistent with the facts that are there, empirical data, and economic theory. We have 53 fallacies already written, and there'll be a publication released later on in the year, whereby we'll release the book and we'll launch the book, and we hope you join us on that journey and just get to be informed by the things we have discovered about the common mistakes we make. So today's fallacy is poor economic performance causes a rise in crime rates in Kenya. But this is not a statement that people started saying the other day. Even during Aristotle's time, there was that strong belief that there's a relationship between poverty, a very strong and direct relationship between poverty and crime rates. And he's quoted saying that poverty is the parent of revolution and crime. So meaning that crime is a reserve for the poor people. And we'll see whether that's true or not. So this claim assumes that there's a direct link between poor economic performance and increasing crime rates. So this link here is assuming a very strong negative correlation, such that if you know economic performance is doing badly, is going down, then it is assumed that crime rates will increase. And here when we talk about crime, we are referring to violent crimes and property crimes, because that's what people mostly refer to when they state this fallacy that poor economic performance results in an increase in crime rates. And then also just to make the distinction between crime rates and crime numbers, because those two are very different. When we speak of crime rates, we are not speaking of crime numbers, which are just the nominal value of crimes, which is, say, in a year we had, 10,000 crimes reported. That's crime numbers, which is the number of crimes reported in a specific duration of time. But then crime rates, it being a rate means it's a ratio. So it's the crime numbers as a share of a particular population. So you can record crime rates as a share, the number of crimes reported as a share of 1,000 population, 1,000 people, 10,000, as you wish to calculate it. But by calculating how many crimes are reported within a specific share of the population and not just the whole population, that gives you a crime rate. So we've talked about the link, we've explained what crimes we're referring to and the distinction between crime rates and nominal numbers. And now let's look at whether this actually makes sense. Is there a relationship between economic performance and crime rates? And to do this, we'll look at it based on economic theory, logic, and empirical data. And then we'll begin with the assumptions people make within these three categories, and then break it down and see whether it's true or not. Beginning with theoretical assumption. So here the assumption is that an economic shock leads to a decline in GDP, and not only GDP, but GDP growth rates, resulting in an increase in unemployment, which therefore leads to an increase in crime rates. I mean, just reading that statement, it sounds so nice to hear, okay, not really nice, but you'd think it makes sense, right? But if you go to look at what research has been done, you find that this double loop that's being assumed in that red statement, that GDP is linked to unemployment and unemployment to crime rates, and that's strong. It's not just the people who claim this fallacy to be true, don't just believe it's true, but they believe so strongly that there's a very strong interrelationship among these three variables. But if you look at economic data and research that has been done, it's not always true. And that's one thing that's a qualifying statement to make it a fallacy. So fallacies are not just things that are not true, but they are statements that are not always true, such as this. So when we say not always true, we looked at research papers looking at the relationship between GDP and unemployment. And one paper studied conducted in the US using data going back 50 years showed that actually in the US there is a negative relationship between GDP growth rates and unemployment. And when we say negative relationship, we mean that there's an inverse proportion, meaning you see how we've used arrows in the red statement to show that when GDP goes down, unemployment goes up. It's true in the US. But when you look at a country like Jordan, for which we also found research indicating that there isn't a very strong negative relationship between GDP and unemployment, this shows us that it's not right for you to just clearly state, okay, always, whatever country you are, whatever your situation, when GDP goes down, you expect unemployment to go up, which results in crime rates, because people assume, when you're jobless, you have nothing to do but to steal. So that's the first disqualifier, that it's not always true that GDP, unemployment, and crime rates have that negative relationship. And what we also think would support our refutation of this claim is that, similar to Jordan, in Kenya we have a very large informal sector. So if it was a very large formal sector, it would be expected that any shock in GDP would affect employment rates, and then now maybe we could have an association with crime rates. But that's not true, because any shock in GDP, and let's think of like the huge shocks, would take a while before they trickle down to those who are employed in the informal sector. So holding that very strong belief that when GDP is shaken a bit, people would lose jobs immediately, a huge proportion of people would lose jobs immediately, and then result to crime. That would not hold in Kenya, because our economy is structured in a very informal way. And then the next set of assumptions are the logical assumptions. This I found very interesting, because it's such a blanket statement to think that the incentive for poor people to commit crimes is just pressure from economic stress. So we're talking about when there's an economic shock and GDP is going down, there's unemployment, right? But now here, when we're talking of poor people, we had a webinar a couple of days back, and we were looking, again, refuting one of these fallacies on whether redistributing income would end poverty in Kenya. And we went down to look at how poverty is actually measured. And poverty is measured based on how much people spend on the very basic needs, such as food. And here, when we say food, it's like minimum caloric requirements, shelter, clothing, shelter and clothing. But then, assuming that this crime, and here we talk violent crimes and property crimes, are just a reserve for the poor, means that since they are not able to meet their very basic needs, then the only thing they can do is go steal. And that's an assumption that people are redistributing income among themselves. It's a redistributive argument that you're taking income from the rich and giving it to the poor through theft. But that's not very true, because contrary to what people believe, that income levels dictate where your crime rates would be, it's not true, because income levels don't say, okay, now since you earn this amount, you're a thief, you're going to be committing violent crimes, you're going to be stealing people's property. But income levels, they protect you from that. They exclude you from that market. What do I mean by this? I mean that the higher the income you have, the more money, or the more resources you have to spend on the cost of security. And security is what would protect you from such crimes of violence and property. So security is anything from your alarm systems to your bodyguards to everything that would protect you and your property. You to purchase that or to acquire that type of security would need more income, and that it would be irrational for you to spend, if you're earning say 300 shillings a day, all that money on security, yet you need to eat, you need to sleep, you need to clothe yourself. So you see, the people who can't afford food, they can't afford shelter, they can't afford clothes, would not see security to that measure as a priority. And therefore, those are the ones who are left vulnerable to criminal activity. And now when you assume that anyone who's poor is a thief, you're alluding to the fact that only the poor people steal. But it's not because they want to, but it's because theft or even just this criminal activity is among people who cannot afford to exclude themselves from that market for criminal activity. So to state that poor people are only the people who commit crime, are the only people who commit this criminal activity is not true, because there are times where even the poor are victims of crime. And then just in addition to this, looking at it at the country level, it is incorrect to assume that income levels would tell you once again how much crime to expect in a certain society. Looking at economies like South Africa and the US, which have relatively high incomes, but their crime rates are higher than their income levels would expect. You wouldn't expect countries at that income level to have such high levels of crime, be it rape, be it theft, but it is actually a reality for them. So moving on, we'll go to the empirical assumptions.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Maureen Barasa from the Institute of Economic Affairs, and I'll be taking you through the empirical assumptions to refute the claim that poor economic performance causes a rise in crime rates in Kenya. And we're going to use some comparison for economic growth rates and crimes. And like my colleague mentioned before, we are using crimes of violence and crimes of property. So looking at figure 1, we are looking at total crimes in Kenya between the years 2004 and 2019. And in our figure, we have the blue lines and the orange lines. For the blue lines, they show the economic growth rates, and for the orange lines, they show the crime rates per 1,000 people. Remember, Anna mentioned before that the crime rates are the crimes committed by 1,000 people in a population, say in a population of 47,600,000 people in Kenya. Per 1,000 people, how many crimes are committed, for us to have a proper comparison of crime rates across regions. And on this figure, we're going to look at the blue line for the economic growth rates, and we have the linear curve for the crime rates per 1,000 people. And looking at this figure, we can clearly see that we had a peak in 2007 and in 2010. In 2007, we had the elections and the post-election violence, but looking at the linear curve for the crime rates per 1,000 people, we can see that it barely changed, and it barely moved. It was between 1.8 and 2 all through the years from 2004 and 2019. And this shows that crime rates are not sensitive to economic growth rates. Even when there were fluctuations, when there was a peak and there was a reduction in the economic growth rates, the The crime rates per 1,000 people barely changed and barely moved. Moving on to the next chart. We'll try to look at the correlation of murders in Kenya with the economic growth rates. We're trying to look whether the correlation between the two, and if one determines another, if the statement poor economic performance, or rather poor economic growth rates, cause maybe an increase in murder rates or crime rates like we've seen before, and we're going to find out. For the blue lines, it shows the murder cases, and the orange lines, it shows the economic growth rates. And again, we're going to focus on the continuous orange line for the economic growth rates, and the linear curve for the murder rates per population of 10,000 people. And looking at the correlation as shown in the figure, it's 0.14, which is a weak correlation. It's between 0.5, and it shows a weak correlation between the murder cases in Kenya and the economic growth rates. For instance, in 1992, we had elections in Kenya, and there was a reduction in the economic growth rates. And looking at the linear curve, it's been dropping all through the years from 5.5 to 7.8 in between 1991 and 2002. And looking at the fluctuation in the economic growth rates, where we had peaks and we had reduction in economic growth rates, the murders have been dropping all through, and this shows a weak correlation between the economic growth rates and the murder rates per 1,000 people in Kenya. Yes. Moving forward, we're looking at the robberies in Kenya between the years 2004 and 2019. And again, the blue line is showing the economic growth rates, and the orange line is showing the robbery rates per a population of 10,000 people. And we can see that there has been fluctuation in economic growth rates, say in 2008, where it was the year after the post-election violence, and we had a disruption in the economy globally in 2008, and we can see that looking at the robbery rates per a population of 10,000 people, it's been dropping all through the years. Like in 2008, looking at the linear curve for the robbery cases, it's been dropping from 2004 to 2019, where we expect maybe according to the statement, the poor economic performance causes a rise in crime rates. We expect it, say in 2008, when the economic growth rate dropped, we expect the crime rates to go higher, robberies and other crimes such as murder and crime generally to go up. But looking at the linear curve, it's been dropping. This shows a weak correlation between the economic growth rates and the robbery cases. The correlation on the figure is 0.09, which is below 0.5, which shows the correlation is weak or either random. Moving forward, we have an illustration of break-ins in Kenya between 2004 and 2019. The blue line again shows the economic growth rates, and the orange one shows the break-ins all through the years between 2004 and 2019. And we can see fluctuations in economic growth rates, and our main focus will be on the linear curve for the break-ins, and we can see it's been dropping all through the years. okay, maybe the numbers have been increasing, but the rates per 10,000 people has been dropping all through the years. And the correlation is a negative at 0.08, which is a weak, or rather maybe considered a random correlation between economic growth rates and the break-ins. And this does not in any way show that poor economic performance causes a rise in crime rates. Moving forward, we came up with some conclusion to refute this fallacy, and the conclusion was that the relationship between economic performance and crime rates is so weak, looking at both the positives for the murders, the suicides, the break-ins. Some were positive, but they were below the 0.5 mark, timing them as either random or weak. And crimes tend to happen in social setups that are far more complex than economic growth. And this shows that the economic growth does not in any way does not directly correlate to crime rates in a country. And we have other factors that rather affect crime rates in a country, such as the inequality and the Gini coefficient. And under this, we found out that crime rates and inequality are positively correlated, and this correlation reflects causation from inequality to crime rates. And yeah, moving forward, we look at the demographic structure. We found studies showing that in communities where most of the population is between males of 18 to 34 years, there were higher crime rates. So the demographic structure determines affects the crime rates in a certain location. And the next one is the number of law enforcement officers. We found out in several studies that in societies where they had more law enforcement officers, or rather police officers in the streets, it was easier for them to control crime rates in that area than in location where the number of police officers per a population of, say, 1,000 people is less than a population that had a larger number of police officers per 1,000 population. They had low levels of crime rates compared to the ones that had few police officers. Then we had the effectiveness of crime control policy, and under this we looked at crime control sanctions such as the drug control, and under this we had three ways of drug control that countries have been using, such as drug suppression, such as suppression of supply, demand management, and public health approach. And under the suppression of supply, we saw that some countries have been using suppression of supply, which in turn increases the price, and this has not been an effective way of controlling crime in the community. And finally, we have opportunity, which is the chance to commit a crime. Say you're working maybe at midnight in a dangerous place, and someone gets a chance to take what you have, maybe your handbag, your laptop. Yeah. So these are the factors that affect crime other than economic performance directly being linked to a rise in crime rate, and that's how we came up with the statement, poor economic performance causing crime rates being a fallacy. Yeah, thank you, John. Okay, we had some sources. we had some sources linking. Sorry, I forgot about this. We had some sources linking to a study that we came to conclude that poor economy causing a rise in crime rates in Kenya being a fallacy. Yeah, we'll post it up in our presentation on the website. Thank you, John.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Anna, Grace, and Maureen for that exposition. They've taken us through the, a breakdown of this fallacy on poor economic performance causes a rise in crime rates. Sorry, I did not introduce myself. My name is John Mutua. I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs as a programs coordinator. And I know I'd swapped, I'd mentioned that Maureen was to start, but apparently it was the other way around, yeah. So anyway, as a way of summary, they've taken us through an argument and trying to basically refute this often made claim that poor economic performance causes a rise in crime rates in Kenya. And I think they, in breaking down or trying to refute this claim, they factored they factored on three assumptions from a theoretical assumption, and what they showed is that, of course, providing examples is that theoretically, of course, it is expected that when we have a shock in the economy, that would obviously lead to a reduction in growth rate. That is likely to affect, lead to unemployment and in turn rise in crime rates. Of course, there's that distinction between just the number of cases of crime or criminal cases reported vis-a-vis crime rate, and no doubt Anna actually differentiated the definition of what those two are, and of course our focus is on the crime rate, and the examples that they provided are related to violent crimes and property crime. And theoretically, what they showed is that this low economic growth that not necessarily lead to a rise in crime, especially due to the fact that largely because of the structure of the economy, and especially in countries where we have maybe a significant informal sector. And also given the fact that we have lags, the economic term that is often used, that we have a lag in the that the transmission mechanism in terms when we have a shock in the economy does not directly lead to other negative effects being felt immediately. So those two things is what she mentioned, just trying to make to refute that fact that theoretically it does not necessarily mean that when we have a shock in the economy that would lead to a rise in crime rates. And then the other one was based on a logical assumption, and here the case was that, for instance, in countries in the US and obviously South Africa, countries that have high income per capita, those countries have one would expect that given the high income levels that crime rates would be low, and yet we know that often from statistics the crime rates are quite high in those two countries. And then Maureen took us through the empirical assumptions, and in that she started by showing the correlations between economic growth rate and crime rate. And also used various examples of both, examples of violent crime, that's murder, robberies, etc., and property crime, break-ins and the like. And again, clearly from an empirical perspective, what we see from this is that data shows that there is weak correlation. Again, obviously, refuting this claim that poor economic performance causes a rise in crime rates in Kenya. And of course, she concluded with some assumptions, I think that were well laid down, so I will not go into that. So thanks a lot to the two of my colleagues, and so without further ado, I will now open this up for question and answer. I see Kennedy's hand raised. Kennedy, you can introduce yourself. You can unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and then pose your question.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mtua. I'm Kennedy. I'm an independent consultant. I'm growing my consultant firm called Agri Consultancy. I was keen on this conversation. I have a simple question. My expectation was that IEA has gone down and done a primary data and mine information from the real what I will call real life sources. I know you're trying to refute what everybody knows, but I think it will be credible. It will have force. It will have energy. If then you told us that, see, we have gone to Kibera, we have gone to Kwatanyayo, we have gone to Nyayo, we have gone to Nyayo Estate, and we have done this work personally ourselves. I know you are using secondary data, but some of these secondary data, you are also not telling us under which conditions they are being mined on. The crime rate in US could be being triggered by something else, but in Kibera it's because we don't have, you know, and I don't know. I don't think in USA they don't have. Maybe they just don't have enough. But here it's we don't have. So I think for me, this workshop fallen short of my expectations. I thought it is a real life experience. In the last 3 months, we have gone rounds. Thank you.
Thanks, Kennedy, for your question. So we'll have a first round of questions. I also see Judith's hand. Judith, please introduce yourself.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Yes, so I must say I was so much waiting for this conversation with the institute. And since I joined the CBC conversation last time, I just want to be on lookout for anything you're talking about, because truly it's exciting. And then I also must acknowledge the presenters, because refuting a theory is a hard job, trust me. So I'm a research and policy analyst. I work with a think tank, and of course I'm much more concerned about issues with touch social justice. So just to my first question, I think Kennedy did actually bring out one of the elements that I wanted to bring out. But one thing that I would have expected the presenters to do is to show us the model first. Like, tell us what assumptions are there. Tell us what factors you've controlled for, because as Kennedy rightfully brought out, is that we might have other factors that can yield different results in the US that cannot be directly translated to Kenya, given that things to do with crime are also very much related to a culture, right? So I know we can do meta-analysis, which is fine, getting to see what different researchers have said, but then it will be very bold of you to maybe refute a theory with doing analysis of other papers that I've done. It would have been good for primary data, so to say, like Kennedy said, because then that will take care of all other factors, because I can imagine even collecting data wouldn't be enough. Things to do with crime, you also want to also do the qualitative bit to understand, because it's more than the figures. There's an element of getting to understand the in-depth what causes crime, because sometimes even it's not poverty, really. There could be other things that are making people take things away from others without their knowledge, so there's a lot to that. So I'm questioning the methodology, just straight to the point. I'm questioning the methodology. And when you question the methodology, then it becomes hard for you to relate to the results. So I think that is the only question that I think came out clearly to me right now. And then I also want Maureen or Anne to speak to the lag time for transmission of shocks from formal to informal economy. The recent COVID-19 shocks that we've experienced, we clearly saw it kicking in the informal economy. I've done a bit on the informal economy, I mean, the hidden economy, so to say. So I just wanted to hear a bit of that because seems like I missed that out. But then again, I really applaud you. You're doing a great job. I don't know how I can make sure that I never miss your conversations. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Judith, for that. I'm sure both Anna and Maureen have noted that, noted your questions. So let me see, and I know Judith, you've more or less basically reiterated what you've typed, so I don't think I need to. Maybe you have an addition.
Correct.
Yeah. Although I don't know whether what you've written, the second one, whether it's different. No. I guess it's it's more or less based on more or less what you've mentioned. So thanks for that. Any other question from our participants before I allow both Maureen and Anna to respond? Okay, if not, I would like to invite Anna and Maureen. I think the two of you can agree on which one you want to, which of the queries you want to respond to.
Thank you. I'll take the first question and a bit of Judith's question, and then Maureen will go in depth with regards to Judith's question. So thank you, Kennedy and Judith, for your very passionate remarks with regards to our presentation. And I get two main concerns about the presentation is the methodology and the COVID-19 shock on the informal sector. I'll speak on the two, beginning with the methodology. So if you were present for the first part of our presentation, where we explained the background of this project, which we call the 53 economic fallacies. And this is a question we've received not once, but I think this is the third time as we're refuting these fallacies through webinars, is that I know there's a desire for, this is what we've collected, this is our primary data, this is our methodology, we've conducted this research, and this is what we found. But refuting 53 fallacies is not a joke. And our methodology was to begin with looking at what does economic theory state about these statements. What does it, is this consistent with economic theory? Are these statements logical? And does the empirical data support these fallacies that people claim to be true? And when we say empirical data, it doesn't, it's not synonymous with primary data. And I know you understand that. And that our goal was not to, our primary objective for these 53 fallacies was not to conduct primary data collection and research for each and every 53 fallacies, but to begin with first just looking at the literature, which is the economic theory, the empirical data that already is readily available through other secondary sources, and just does this appeal to logic? Those were our goals, our primary objectives for these 53 fallacies, but not to mean that we'll not go further and look at what's the case in, say, like Kennedy mentioned, in Kibera, what is the effect of the economic shocks on crime rates? So I hope that answers the first questions. It's not that our methodology is inconsistent with common research, but the methodology we used for the 53 economic fallacies was to look at the fallacy against the three benchmarks, which is theory, empirical data, and logic, and then see whether it's actually a true claim or not. So that was our methodology, not a regular research paper. methodology. And then Judith, I'll answer part of your question, which was to find out the lag, the transmission lag for economic shocks on crime rates. The first paper I mentioned about the relationship between GDP growth rates and unemployment in the US, sorry, again, this is another paper that has already been written, used data going back 50 years. And US is peculiar because first, it's a very developed economy and the data is very rich. 50 years worth of data is a very rich data bank. So in that study, they found that yes, there is actually a negative relationship between GDP growth rates and unemployment. But if we look at Kenya's case, maybe we might not have data going back 50 years, and the structure of our economies are very different. You know that? So given that this presentation was not based off research exactly like the one done in the US, I cannot be able to strongly tell you that the transmission takes 4 years, 5 years, but I can tell you that we did calculate the crime rates in the year 2020, and we found out that the crime rates for total crimes in the year 2020 was 1.43 crimes per 1,000 people. So given Kenya's population, divided that by 1,000, and then now divided the total crimes reported by that share of the population, and it was 1.43. If you can allow me to take you back to our presentation where we had this slide, figure 1, total crimes in Kenya. As of 2019, the total crime rate was 1.86. That is in 2019. Yeah? We were not doing so badly. Then 2020, COVID-19 came through, and you can see the crime rate dropped from 1.86 to 1.43. So that's a span of 12 months, 1 year, and the crime rate has dropped by about 0.4 points. So I think it's almost immediate, but depending on the strength of that shock. COVID-19 cannot be compared to post-election violence. They're both shocks, but of different natures. This was a health crisis that led to an economic shock. 2007 post-election violence was a political phenomena that led to post-election violence, and they differ. And that's why we stated in our conclusion that we're not saying that economic performance does not at all influence crime rates. I mean, there are correlations. If there was no relationship, the correlation would be 0.00. But there are correlations on the positive and negative side, but they are below 0.5%, which is very weak. A correlation below 0.5 is, as we say here, it's almost random. You cannot say that crime rates are very sensitive to economic shocks. And we now highlight other factors, like even Kennedy mentioned, that influence the crime rate, the position of the crime rates. So it's not looking at these two variables like islands. It's not just a univariate analysis. An analysis of the position of a country in terms of crime rates involves more than just one indicator of economic performance, which hardly explains the crime rates. You should look at things like inequality, which Maureen will talk about, your demographic structure, the number of law enforcement officers, your crime control policy, and even just the opportunity to commit crimes. So I hope that has answered your questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. Maureen, you have something to add as well?
I'd also like to answer the question on inequality. Like I mentioned earlier, crime rates and inequality are positively correlated, and the correlation reflects causation from inequality to crime rates. And the question from Judith, where it's more of a comment than a question. Shrinking economy significantly pronounces the gap between the haves and the have-nots, which indeed increases crime rates. And also the question on the lag time for transmission of shocks from formal to informal economy. We can't tell the time at the moment, maybe 4 to 5 years, as Anna mentioned, but the unemployment rate for Kenya is very low, looking at the workforce being more informal, and this means the direct structural strain between economic growth and crime rates is indirect. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anna and Maureen for that attempt. We have, I hope it's clear, they've in the attempt to respond to those two questions from Kenneth and Judith. I think it was quite clear.
Can I say something?
Yes, Kennedy.
Yeah, thanks so much. Part of the reason why myself I'm doing my thesis, and part of the reason why I'm always very keen on what IEA does is because IEA is widely quoted in many of the research students, what students are writing in their thesis. So if you review a lot of work, you get a lot of documents. So I think for me, this what you're doing here, and it will be publicized, it is going to inform a lot of research moving forward. And for me, I think there's need for IEA to sit back and dive deep into this research, because you are changing how research is being done in this country. It's not fair that you do 53 fallacies to counter what people know, but you are just using very superficial information, and you're actually going to change even how you are quoted in PhD thesis in this country. So I think for me, if 53 was too much, just do 10 and ensure you do intensive. Like, this is where you'll die from, because this is going to change the theses and the experiments we are doing in this country. And I think for me it's unfair to the body of knowledge to just use what other people have done. I've done research. Research is never done from one perspective. You assume so many things. It's unfair to use that to base on your research, which really changes many things in the country. Anyway, I'm not quarreling, but I'm just trying to be passionate of what I'm saying. I hope you guys listen.
Thanks, Kennedy. I guess I'll also invite Kwame maybe just to explain the background of these fallacies, just to basically rehash so that it's clear to our participants. I see in the chat box we have a question from Njogu. Let me just read that. I know, Judith, you had raised your hand. Let me first just read what Njogu has. Just go through Njogu's question. Then, Judith, I will give you an opportunity again to either make a comment or raise a question, pose a question. So from Njogu, what Njogu says is, does poor economic performance lead to increased innovations based on the fact that the relationship has been observed to be near random, e.g., different ways of doing things emerge in different situations? So Maureen and Anna, you can note that. Of course, if it's not clear, then I can ask Njogu to expound on it. Judith, do you have another query?
Yeah, so I think I was just sort of in one way or the other reacting to what Kennedy has said. And I totally respect what he said, because we are looking at Institute of Economic Affairs. Like whenever I see Kwame in the news and being interviewed, I just want to follow, because I know there's a lot of information I'll get from there. So it will be really nice and great to maybe revisit the methodology. Me as a researcher for the last 6 years, even when I was doing my PhD thesis, I had moments where I sort of thought that this is what it is. But then again, when it's subjected to a different eye, a new perspective kicks in. So I really appreciate Anne and is it Melody or whoever?
Maureen.
Yes, Maureen. Yeah, so it's a very good job and what they've done. But maybe I can just encourage them to look at other factors that they've not factored in, like, let me just call them, like other factors that affect confounding variables and such kind of a thing, and just to rethink the idea again. And I'll be more than happy to come back here and see what these results are saying, because then crime and social justice, which is so passionate to my heart, really work together. So yeah, so we are happy and we are following and we are happy with what you're doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Judith. Thanks for that. Kwame, would you like to just weigh in on some of those comments that have been mentioned, and then I will invite both either Anna or Maureen to respond to Jogu's question.
All right. So thanks, John. Thanks, Maureen and Anna. Well, I think let's remind ourselves what this discussion is about. Now, it's clear we haven't made ourselves clear. The function of the 53 fallacies that we've generated, that we are writing upon, are basically statements that are made, as a matter of fact, whether in the press, by Kenyans, in conversations and all that. And the function of this compilation is not to publish PhD quality theses or journal articles. It is to advance public debate based on what is known about economic theory and what is observable and what the data suggests. So that's the first. The second is that there's a limit to how much you can use primary data based on resource availability and also the time that's available. So our function is not to write papers that will appear in PhD thesis. Our function is to write a policy brief or an educational brief that allows people to be able to understand statements and at least to educate them around statements made about the economy that any economist worth his salt knows is patently false. So let's go down, because I think methodology is a big issue here. So let's go down to what the function of this. If you read the fallacy, we say that the claim specifically is that poor economic performance leads to a rise in crime rates. So the first thing you will notice from that is this theory, even if you take that as our hypothesis, it is not that we are trying to explain crime rates. What we are interested in finding out is whether the claim that economic growth and employment numbers correlate in a negative way with crime rates is false or not. So the only answer we owe based on that question is either yes or no. It is not to produce confounding variables or to say that other factors will cause crime. So that's the first. The second thing is the function of this study, this presentation that my two colleagues have made, is not to explain crime. In fact, what they're saying is there might be thousands of things that explain crime, but the main one that people are making a claim about, and if you look at newspapers and everything else, people say, oh, if you create an employment, there's going to be jobs. If jobs are lost, then we expect crimes to. All we're just trying to say is that statement is not an informed statement based on economic theory, based on economic theory, based on logic, and based on the empirical facts. That's certain, and that's clear. That's clear for us. The third one is the question of data. If you look at the data that has been applied, it is 21 years worth of data over time, and the only thing you've done it's to do a basic linear correlation between crime rates on the one side and these variables that we talked about, whether it's violence or whether it's theft. And the finding is on the basis of correlation alone, those statements, I mean, those statistical connection is very, very weak as to lead us not to conclude, to conclude that those two factors are not connected in the way the statement said. So let's remind ourselves, it is true, credibility is important. We are not trying to publish a PhD quality or journal quality thesis based on this pattern. What we are trying to explain is to tell somebody that you have to be very careful if you're going to attribute crime rates to economic factors for the reasons that you cited. I hope that's clear. So are we committed to credibility? Yes, we are committed to credibility. Are we committed to the use of data and statistical analysis? Yes, that's what we are very committed to. But please don't ask us to answer the question we did not. The question we wanted to answer, if I repeat, is this. If somebody makes a claim that because there was a COVID shock last year, for instance, that's a huge shock both on GDP growth rates and also on employment, are we supposed to be on the basis of that to expect crime rates to rise? And evidence based on data in other parts of the world and show that there's a very weak connection in terms of the claim that there's a direct transmission from economic growth rates and employment to criminal rates reported. That's all. It's very simple, and I think perhaps it's the disappointing thing for many of you is that it's simple, but that's what we sought to answer because those are the questions we receive, and that's how we wanted to elevate that question. It was not to provide you with an alternative for what explains crime. We are simply saying that we might have 1,000 things causing crime. Economic growth rates per se, unemployment numbers alone, based on Kenya and other places, should not be your concentration, or you should not make such a huge assertion. I hope that's clear. So for that reason, I think you should be kinder to my colleagues, Maureen and Anna Grace, because all they were trying to do is to make the statement of fallacy known, because that's it. That's it, just to show you that this is a fallacy based on the data that we've provided. So I hope we answer them. We concentrate on what the question is. It might be too simple because that's what fallacies is supposed to be, but our intention is not to publish a publication which is journal quality articles. It is simply to have a conversation. Some of these questions come from us, from high school people or other people who tell us, please ask, this question is this. They don't want to read a journal article with extreme dedication and decomposition of the data to provide a model. So we apologize. We did not think it's necessary to provide a model, because if you have an association that is 0.14, it's so weak statistically that even if you build a model, it is unlikely that if you build another model and you do the separations, you're going to find a stronger link than that. So thanks a lot, John. I thought I needed to clarify the question of the methodology. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kwame. I hope it's clear to both Kennedy and Judith, and of course to the rest of our participants. I guess just to mention also the idea of this fallacy is obviously just to jolt basically people to think conceptually or intuitively and from an economic a theoretical perspective. So that's basically one of the objectives. So that, for instance, if one is making certain arguments, they can through these fallacies figure out how to make those arguments from a theoretical all the way to an empirical perspective. But at the same time, obviously, these are things that can, as we've noted, this is not necessarily a study or like an empirical research. These are fallacies, but these are things that can be picked by anyone. Even for instance, within IEA, in some of these we've done or we plan to do some specific research work in the same. Yeah, so that's the other objective of the fallacies. So I'd like to invite Maureen or Anna Grace, if you could respond to Njogu's. I'm looking for Njogu's question. Maureen.
Hello, hi. Could Njogu please rephrase his question? I am not We're not getting it clearly.
Jogu, are you in there?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, would you like to expound a little bit?
Yes. Thank you very much. And I would like to introduce myself first. My name is Dr. Jogu Barua. This is my first webinar to participate in. And I also want, before I rephrase my question, to echo what Kennedy has raised, because one of my motivating factors to join the Institute of Economic Affairs is to get factual data. This is because, as a profession, I'm a politician, I'm a former member of parliament, and we have been accused from time and again of making general statements. So one of my expectations of benefit from this forum is to get data which I can use to communicate to the public. So the question I'm asking is that the fallacy is that poor economic performance leads to increased crime rates, and the assumption here from where I sit is that if it would be true, then it means that crime in this case will be looked at as a way of getting livelihoods. That is because the economy is not performing, people resort to crime to get to earn their livelihoods. So from the study which has been presented, the relationship between the two factors has been seen to be weakly correlated or random. So my question here I'm asking, when the situation of poor economic performance arises, do Kenyans adjust to do things differently so that they can earn their livelihoods in a different way? In other words, do they adjust as per the situation so that the economic situation does not affect them? For example, before COVID was a major shock, and when we got COVID, like the rest of the world, things changed. That's why you're having many webinars. When you go to restaurants, there's outside catering or home deliveries. So the question I'm asking, do people get more innovative so that they can supplement the gap or fill the gap? Thank you.
Thanks, Njogu. Anna, Grace, or Maureen, I hope it's clear now. Do you want to give it a go?
Okay, thank you for rephrasing your question. And okay, so I've gotten 2 points out of that. The first question is, what do people resort to if we're saying they're not resorting to criminal activity? And then, is there innovation? Like, what are people doing to salvage the situation? So again, I'll just state this, that we state that a fallacy is an economic fallacy is a statement about the economy that people claim to be true, but is not consistent with economic theory, is not consistent with empirical data and observable characteristics. It's either that or it's that plus not always true. So I presented a slide where, let me just go back to it. Part of our presentation included the logical assumptions. And I think I can also answer something, I can speak to something that Judith has asked about. She stated that we should state our assumptions more clearly. When the presentation will be posted on our website, you will see that for all these assumptions, we've highlighted them in red. So those are the assumptions where the people make, and then what's in black is what we are refuting that assumption with. So for this logical assumptions, what you're saying, Mr. Njogu, is that all poor people, I mean, or rather what these people state is that the incentive for poor people to commit crimes is pressure from economic stress, meaning that since they can't afford the food, they can't afford the shelter, they can't afford the clothing, they'll simply just take it forcefully from other people, right? And that means, if we go by what that trade statement says, is that every poor person is a thief. Every poor person is a thief. And that's clearly not true. I mean, there are people in the streets who beg and they don't necessarily steal. They can't afford it for themselves, but they go ask for it. And that's not crime, right? They're not thieves, or at least not at that particular moment. So even just from that observation that we have we have beggars on the street, and we have people who steal even in broad daylight or in pitch darkness, is already something that speaks against this statement that all poor people are criminals. But to speak on your question on whether there's any innovation, I think even just that begging is an innovation in itself. But I want to speak about the counter. So we are talking about economic performance being on the decline and crime rates being on the incline, right? But let's look at a situation where the inverse, where there is improved economic performance and lower crime rates. If that is true, and yeah, like we said, in the US, you'd see that there is, when there is good economic performance, unemployment is on the low, right? But you see, for these countries, you'd find that they're not only just focusing on controlling crime rates. There are other factors that, like we said, you need to consider when you're looking at this whole crime and the economy issue. So, like we mentioned, there are policies on narcotics control. They have better education systems. Actually, there's a paper that we read as we were carrying out our research by Stephen Levitt, that actually shows that there's a positive correlation between violent crime and there's a relationship between violent crime and high school graduation rates. That's education policy. The more people you have educated and being involved in more constructive activities, probably the lower your violent crime would go, right? The higher GDP per capita, that is, the higher police officers per inhabitants, then the lower the crime rates observed, at least within the US. So I'm speaking about innovation in the event economic performance is doing well. And it's not intended exactly like, okay, so we are going to improve graduation rates and immediately we'll see a decline in crime rates. But it's all these engines working together effectively and efficiently to improve social welfare, which lower crime rates is actually an indicator. I see your hand is still up, but let my colleague Maureen say something about the same, and then we can hear from you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Njogu, for your question. Okay, we can't ascertain whether the statement poor economic performance leads to increased innovation. Okay, we can't base it on data since we don't have the data. Okay, yes, we've seen resilience in Africans. Even during COVID times, there was a shift from physical learning to online learning, among other things, like you've talked about food delivery and all that, but we can't ascertain. But we all know that good economic performance increases public service delivery and the economy is running well. But we can't we don't have data yet to prove that poor economic performance leads to more innovation. But if we do, we'll do more research on that, and we'll do a session like this to explain that. Thank you.
See, Njogu, is your hand still up or?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
I just want to commend the two presenters for a good attempt to my question. I just want to comment that I did not assume that all poor people are criminals. But the thing is that this research is based on that space whereby there's a drastic change in economic environment. So my assumption here is, as a researcher, is that this should be a longitudinal study which shows before, present, and after, so that you can have a good comparative data. What I'm talking about, the issue I'm talking about, innovations, it is not another the paradigm, but I think from the way you are presented, or the two ladies are presented, this is what this is an inference. Is in fact that if these guys who are affected by, the people who are affected by poor economic performance do not automatically go to the direction of crime to get a livelihood, it means that they must have adjusted in one way or the other. And that's why I'm asking whether they maybe end up being more innovative to continue surviving without resorting to crime. Otherwise, I'm happy with the responses and I hope to continue participating. I am Dr. Barua. I have a PhD in entrepreneurship. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Njogu. I guess for any of the queries that are maybe not exhaustively, whatever, we could have bilaterals or even post something on our website. As we'll be posting the presentation, we can add some stuff just to maybe respond to those queries. But again, thanks Maureen and Anna for that. Do we have any more questions from our participants? I don't see any additional questions in the chat box. Final opportunity for queries or comments. Okay, if not, I will allow, guess we're heading to 11:30. Both Maureen and Anna to just make their final remarks, and then we can close here.
Okay, thank you, John. I'd like to say the statement poor economic performance causes a rise in crime rates in Kenya. I don't think it's right to assume that if people are poorer, crime increases as people steal for their sustenance. And from the data we provided, it shows that changes in the economy does not explain the changes in crime rates, and we've shown that there's a weak correlation between crime rates such as robbery, homicide, and break-ins, and the economic growth in general. And yeah, we'll do more explanations on the 53 economic fallacies one by one as time goes by to refute these claims that are deemed correct, but they're factually, empirically, and theoretically incorrect. Thank you.
Thanks, Maureen. Anna?
Thank you all for making the time to join us today to listen to us present this fallacy. Sorry it didn't meet your expectations on some fronts, but it's still work in progress. And I hope that we will actually conduct tweet chats. So for those of you who are not familiar, tweet chats are like webinars, but on text, on Twitter. So stay tuned for that, and we'll improve our presentation, maybe include more research and any new findings we'd have found. But my concluding remarks are this, that we are not saying at all that economic performance does not affect crime rates or is not related to crime rates. For sure, as we have shown you, if that was true, we'd have a correlation coefficient of 0.0000. But in some instances, depending on the crime we are looking at, the correlation is positive or negative, but below the bounds of positive 0.5 and negative 0.5. So there is a relationship, but it's so insignificant that it's wrong to assume that crime rates are sensitive or are as sensitive as people purport to economic performance. But to look at how these two interact, it's important to look at other factors at play in the economy, because the economy, as we said, is not just these two variables, but everything from demographic characteristics to law enforcement. And all these factors actually, it's like one big engine with the small parts at work. So thank you very much and have a lovely day.
Thanks a lot, Anna and Grace, for those insights. I think we've had a very lively, no doubt we've had a very lively discussion. So I'd like to urge basically thank our participants for setting out time to just join us in this webinar. We'll be having many more of these, not only we'll have more on this, specifically on the fallacies, as I mentioned in the build-up to the launch, but also please look out for other webinars that the Institute of Economic Affairs will be holding in the few coming weeks. We usually post all this information in social media as well as on our website. And I have to also mention that IEA is a membership organization, so you're also welcome to be a member and just to benefit on a couple of things in terms of the research products that we churn out, as well as just opportunity to engage in policy discourse and so on and so forth. Otherwise, thanks a lot again, and have a good morning. Thank you. Bye-bye.